Okay, here we are with Chapter 4, Psychology, Sensation, and Perception. First thing we're going to look at is, this is the chapter in which we'll talk about how we perceive the world through our sensations. And so, first off, we're going to talk about the life of Helen Keller. And it's an example of how people can compensate for loss of one or more senses. A childhood illness left Helen Keller deaf and blind at the age of 19 months. When Keller was nearly 7, Anne Sullivan became her teacher. Keller learned to communicate through a manual alphabet. Keller learned to speak. She learned to listen to others speak. She attended Radcliffe College, and she and Sullivan traveled and lectured around the world, focusing attention on the deaf and the blind. Helen Keller used her fingers to be able to identify and talk with people, and it helped her understand what people were saying. Inspired by Keller's legacy, Filipino students developed a device that converts text messages into Braille, the writing system for the blind. Section 1. The stimulation and interpretation of our senses are limited by variable thresholds. Our senses adapt to changing conditions and environments. Physical and psychological factors affect our perception. Sensation is the process by which our 5 senses gather information and send it to the brain. Perception is the way in which we interpret this information. So our focus for this section is what processes and concepts affect the stimulation of the senses. How does the process of sensory adaptation work? And what is signal detection? Sensation is the stimulation of sensory receptors and transmission of sensory information to the central nervous system. Stimulation of the senses is automatic. Perception is the psychological process through which we interpret sensory stimulation. The absolute threshold is the weakest amount of a stimulus that can be sensed. Absolute thresholds differ from humans to animals and also from person to person. Difference threshold is the minimum amount of difference that can be detected between 2 stimuli. It is known as the difference threshold. People's individual difference thresholds vary slightly. For vision, our stimulus is electromagnetic energy. Our receptors are rods and cones in the retina. The formula for what our absolute threshold should be is that we should be able to see a candle flame viewed from a distance about 30 miles on a dark night. Hearing, however, the stimulus is a sound wave. The hair cells of our inner ear are what are activated, and we should be able to hear the ticking of a watch from about 20 feet away in a quiet room. I wonder what they use as that standard now, since nobody have watches that ticks anymore. Smell. It's a chemical substance in the air. Receptor cells in the nose allow us to detect smell. About 1 drop of perfume diffused throughout a small house would be our absolute threshold. So taste is the chemical substances that come in contact with our saliva, and they're detected by our taste buds on the tongue. And you should be able to detect 1 teaspoon of sugar dissolved in 2 gallons of water. Touch is pressure on the skin, and it's detected by the receptors or nerve endings in the skin. And you should be able to detect the wing of a fly falling on a cheek from about a distance less than half an inch. Our sensory systems adapt to changing environment. Sensory adaptation is the process by which we become more sensitive to weak stimuli and less sensitive to unchanging stimuli. When your eyes adapt to the darkness, when people adapt to the sounds of city traffic, are examples. Some stimuli do not display this kind of adaptation. We do not usually adapt to pain. Signal detection theory is a method of distinguishing sensory stimuli that takes into account not only stimuli strength, but also such as the settings, your physical state, your mood, and your attitude. It also considers psychological factors such as your motivation, your expectation, and your learning. Animal senses. Over the centuries, people have reported that animals appear to have a sixth sense for detecting earthquakes, hurricanes, volcanic eruptions, and tsunamis. In more recent times, animals' acute senses have been used to help the disabled, find missing persons, sniff out bombs and or drugs, and of course tracking people. In December 2004, animals sensed the impending tsunami in Indian Ocean that struck dozens of Asian and African countries. Alan Robinowitz of the Wildlife Conservation Society says that many animals can detect changes in the environment that humans cannot. Dogs have been shown to accurately predict epileptic seizures. Dogs can sniff out survivors after a disaster. A recent study trained wasps to detect many different odors, and the training may be used to sniff out bombs and drugs. Sheep can recognize about 50 sheep and 10 human faces and remember them for 2 years. Specialized areas of the sheep brain, similar to those in humans, encode facial identity. By studying these areas, scientists may help people who have lost their ability to recognize faces as a result of the brain injury. Service dogs like this one become more protective of their charges before the onset of an epileptic seizure. Section 2. Vision. Light enters the eye, which relays information to the brain and allows us to see. People with normal color vision can see all colors in the spectrum of visible light. People who do not have normal color vision are said to be colorblind. The main idea of this section is to talk about the light interacting with how the eye allows us to see, and people with normal vision can adapt to changing light conditions, can see any color in the spectrum of visible light. So our questions for this section that you should be able to answer is, how does light work? What are the main parts of the eye, and what allows us to have color vision? What colors color blindness? Light electromagnetic is a electromagnetic energy described in wavelengths. Electromagnetic spectrum is the light that is visible to humans and light that is not. The light that humans can see makes up only a small part of the spectrum. The main colors of the spectrum are known as Roy G. Biv: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. And you can remember that by using the acronym Roy G. Biv. The amount of light that enters the eye is determined by the size of the opening in the colored part of the eye, which is the pupil. The lens adjusts to the distance of objects by changing its thickness. The retina is a sensitive surface that consists of neurons. The neurons that are sensitive to light are called photoreceptors. The blind spot is when the light hits the point where the optic nerve leaves the eye. The eye registers nothing because that area lacks photoreceptors. The area that does not have photoreceptors is called the blind spot. Everybody has a blind spot. Rods and cones. The two kinds of photoreceptors are rods and cones. Rods are sensitive only to brightness and allow us to see black and white. Cones provide vision. Rods are more sensitive to light than cones. The dark and light adaptation. The adjustment to lower levels of light is called dark adaptation. The ability to see low light continues to improve for about up to 45 minutes. Adaptation to bright light occurs within a minute or two. Adaptation to bright light happens much more quickly than adaptation to the dark. Visual acuity is the sharpness of vision. It is determined by the ability to see visual details in normal light. Eye charts are used to measure visual acuity. Being nearsighted means a person has to be close to an object to make out its details. Being farsighted means a person has to be farther away from an object to make out its details. As people age, they become more farsighted. In the human eye, light travels through the pupil to the lens and is reflected onto the retina. The optic nerve sends the visual information to the brain. The rods and cones are light receptors within the retina. The color wheel. The color wheel is made up of colors of the spectrum bent into a circle. Complementary colors are the colors across from each other on the color wheel. Color vision refers to light. It does not refer to pigment. When complementary colors of light are mixed, they form gray. In humans, some cones are sensitive to blue, and some to green, and some to red. When more than one kind of cone is stimulated, we perceive other colors. Human color vision differs from that of many animals. Fish have no cones and see no color. Dogs have two types of cones. They see fewer colors than humans. Birds have 4 or more cones and see a wide variety of colors. In fact, birds have been used by the Coast Guard to help them be able to identify people in the water. So when they're flying, the birds are trained to be able to direct helicopter pilots towards the people that they may have overlooked otherwise. Afterimages. An afterimage is the visual impression that remains after the original image is removed. The afterimage is complementary color of the color of the original image. The afterimage of black is white. The afterimage of white is black. Most afterimages last a few seconds and up to a minute. They occur when the cones of the eye become tired after staring intensely at a single color. The size of an afterimage depends on the distance from which it is viewed. Gray is in the middle of the wheel because when the complementary colors of light mix, they form gray. This is an interesting experiment. Afterimage is a typical optical illusion. In this lab, you'll experiment with the afterimage by staring at this strangely colored flag above. Place a piece of blank white paper on your desk. Stare at the center of this flag for about 30 seconds. Try not to look away. Don't look at the things to the side either. Stare directly at the flag. Repeat the experiment. After about 30 seconds or so, look at your paper. Repeat the experiment, but this time look at a distant wall after you've stared at the flag. You should see a color change when you do this. So what I'm going to do is we're going to do this for 30 seconds. So everybody get out a sheet of paper. And you should be ready. It should be a white sheet of paper too, by the way. All right, so what I would like you to do is stare directly at your image. And ready, begin. Okay, now stare at your sheet of paper, and you should have a different experience as this occurs to you. Okay. So, what happens after you look intensely at a single color? The after image will appear, and it will be complementary color, not the color that was focused on. Color blindness. Normal color vision is when a person can see colors of the visible spectrum. Color blindness occurs when people do not have normal color vision due to a malfunction in their cones. Partial color blindness is common. A total color blindness is rare. Most people who are colorblind have red and green color blindness. Color blindness is always inherited, and males are more likely to inherit color blindness than females. And that explains why men are so bad at matching colors and picking out clothes that match, because their eyes are not as sensitive to color as they are for women. There is no cure for color blindness, but it does not cause any great deal of impairment. So as you can see here, there's an image here that you should be able to identify a number. If you have normal color vision, you should be able to see the number, and people with red-green color blindness will see the number 3. A person with total color blindness would see no number. So most of you probably see an 8. A few of you probably see 3s, and maybe somebody may not see anything at all. Section 3, hearing. This is the one I'm bad at. Hearing is the ear allows us to hear and locate sounds which have their own pitch and loudness. Deafness may be inherited and caused by disease, injury, or old age. The ear is the human instrument for sensing sound, and when parts of the ear are damaged, deafness can occur. So, what you should write down in this section is what are the 2 characteristics does every sound have, and what are the main parts of the ear and how do they work? What are some of the causes of deafness? Sound is caused by changes in air pressure that result from vibration. Each vibration is called a cycle or a sound wave. Every sound has its own pitch and loudness. The pitch of a sound is how high or low it is. Pitch depends on the frequency of sound. Frequency is the number of cycles per second. The number of cycles per second, the higher the pitch of the sound. Loudness is determined by the height or amplification of sound waves. The higher the amplification, the louder the sound. Loudness is measured in decibels. So here we have a chart of some common sounds. 0 decibels is a threshold for hearing. Prolonged exposure to sounds greater than 85 decibels will cause some hearing loss. Sounds of 130 decibels can cause immediate hearing loss. So a jet engine causes severe pain at 150 decibels. A shotgun blast, which I've been around a few of those, is 140 decibels, and that's pretty bad as well. Rock concert is 120 decibels and causes pain. Thunder can be up to 110. A subway train is often 90. The average car is 80 decibels. Your typical conversation at 3 feet apart is 60 decibels, and hearing leaves rustle as you walk across the yard might be 40 decibels. 2 people whispering would be at the low end of the hearing threshold, which would be 20 decibels, and a watch ticking barely registers, if at all. The ear is shaped to recognize the capture of sound waves. The brain and the nervous system actually hear sounds. The ear has 3 parts: the outer ear, the middle ear, and the inner ear. The eardrum transmits sound to the bones in the middle ear, which then transmits sound to the inner ear. The inner ear consists of the cochlea. Sound makes fluid with the cochlea vibrate, sending neuron impulses to the brain via the auditory nerve. We can locate sound by turning the head to increase the sound. We use visual cues to locate sound. Some of the sound enters the outer ear and is funneled to the eardrum. Inside the middle ear, the hammer, anvil, stirrup vibrate, transmitting sound to the inner ear. Then it enters the cochlea. And then the cochlea interprets the sound and sends it to the auditory nerve for the brain to interact. Conductive deafness occurs because of damage to the middle ear, which is the part that amplifies sound. Hearing aids can provide for the function of the middle ear by amplifying sound. Sensorineural deafness occurs when sounds of certain frequencies are not heard. It's usually caused by damage to the inner ear. Loud sounds can destroy neurons in the ear. The cochlear implants can help people with sensorineural deafness. Deafness in the world today. In recent years, deaf people have been able to come more into the mainstream sensory experience. Some deaf people choose not to enter into the mainstream of the sensory experience. Society has recently become more sensitive to the needs of deaf people through the use of the following: interpreters, more courses in American Sign Language, closed caption television shows, and advances in repairing the damage inside the ears. The bionic ear. For those who are severely hard of hearing or profoundly deaf, the world is mostly a silent place. But in 1985, when the cochlear implant was approved for testing, the technology held out great hope for the deaf. Since its introduction, however, the device has been the source of controversy and it has divided the deaf community. A cochlear implant is a small electronic device that is surgically placed behind the ear. The device generates signals that the auditory nerve conveys to the brain. The recipient must learn how to understand the sounds it transmits. Some deaf people question the psychological impact of the device on children, and in recent years, opposition to the implant has decreased. The implant has support from many members of the deaf community. The microphone, speech processor, and transmitter are placed behind the ear. The receiver, stimulator, and electrode arrays are implanted in the skull in the inner ear. Section 4. We perceive smell and taste by sensing molecules of certain substances. Sensory receptors on our skin allow us to sense pressure, temperature, and pain. Body senses help keep our balance and stand up straight. So the main idea for this section, in addition to the vision and hearing, people possess the senses of smell and taste. We also have skin and body senses. So how do we sense and smell and taste? What are skin senses? And what body senses allow us to stand upright and coordinate our movements? Smell. People do not have a strong sense of smell as many of the animals do. Odors are detected by receptor neurons in the nose. The receptors send information about the odors to the brain via the olfactory nerve. Taste. Most researchers agree on 4 basic taste qualities: sweet, sour, salty, and bitter. Lately, they've also included a sense known as umami. We sense taste through the receptor neurons located on taste buds in the tongue. Taste cells reproduce rapidly. Now, that's why if you burn your tongue on hot food, you're still able to taste things where other cells are often destroyed when they get burned. The body is covered with hairs from some very tiny sensory receptors. In the hair cells fire with the skin. Sensory receptors in the hair cells fire when the skin is touched. Other structures beneath the skin are also sensitive to pressure. The sense of pressure undergoes rapid adaptation. Temperature. Sensations of temperature are relative. Neurons beneath the skin surfaces are receptors for temperature. As the sense of pressure, people adapt rapidly to the sense of temperature. Pain. The more pain receptors located in a particular area, the more sensitive that area is. Pain moves from the point of contact to the spinal cord and then to the thalamus in the brain. It is then projected to the cerebral cortex, where a person registers the location and severity of the pain. Chemicals called prostaglandins help transmit pain messages to the brain. The gate theory of pain suggests that only a certain amount of information can be processed by the nervous system at a time. Rubbing or scratching an injured area transmits sensations to the brain that compete with pain messages. This can have the effect of relieving pain. Vestibular sense tells you whether you are physically upright without having to use your eyes. It works via sensory organs in the ear that monitor the body's motion. It works via the sensory organs in the ear that monitor the body's motion and position in relation to gravity. Kinesthesis is the sense that informs people about the position and motion of their bodies. It works via sensory organs in the joints, tendons, muscles, and send information to the brain. So the vestibular sense for a dancer tells them whether they are spinning and upright, where the kinesthesis tells them whether they're moving forward or backwards and that kind of thing. So finally, we have perception. Perception allows us to organize and make sense of our sensory impressions. Cues help people perceive movement and motion and judge depth and perspective. The brain can trick the eye through visual illusions. So, for perception, this section on perception, perception is the way which we organize our sensory impressions. Movement, depth, and constancy are some of the ways in which we make sense of these impressions. So for this section, you want to make sure you take notes on what are the main rules for perceptual organization, how is the movement perceived, and what cues do we use for depth perception. What are perceptual constancies? And why do we see visual illusions? Rules of perceptual organization. Closure is an important rule for perceptual organization. Closure is the tendency to perceive a complete or whole figure even when there are gaps in what your senses tell you. It works when you try to fit pieces of information into a familiar pattern. The figure ground perception is the perception of figures against a background. So here you see gaps, and we tend to put those gaps together, and you probably see a dog rather than just a random series of black marks. Figure ground, you see either the object or the figures that are in the, so we can see these two things. Proximity is the nearness of objects or figures to each other. The law of similarity says that people think of similar objects as belonging together. The law of continuity says that people usually prefer to see smooth, continuous patterns than disrupted ones. The law of common fate says that people assume things that have the same purpose when they are part of the same group. So here we see proximity. We kind of see the lines as pairs rather than as separate. So we might see these as roads or tubes or something like that, rather than, and so then you see you tend to see the X's and the O's rather than XO, XO, XO. In continuity, you see this as a wavy line passing through a straight line rather than line segments. Perception of movement. To sense movement, humans need to see an object change its position relative to other objects. Stroboscopic motion. In stroboscopic motion, the illusion of movement is produced by showing the rapid progression of images or objects that are not moving. Movies are an example of stroboscopic motion, where the pictures change gradually and you see that as actual movement. Monocular cues need only one eye to be perceived. Monocular cues include perspective, clearness, overlap, shadow, and texture gradient. The most complex monocular cue is motion parallax. Motion parallax is the tendency of the object to seem to move forward or backward depending on how far away they are from the viewer. And this can be a problem for drivers frequently at stoplights. Binocular cues require both eyes to be perceived. Retinal disparity is a binocular cue for perceiving depth based on the difference between two images of an object that the retina receives as an object moves closer. Convergence is a binocular cue associated with feelings of tension in the eye muscles. Size constancy. Size constancy is the tendency to perceive an object as being one size no matter how far away the object is. It's learned through experience. Color constancy. The tendency to perceive objects as keeping their color even though different light might change the appearance of their color. This too is learned through experience. Shape constancy is the knowledge that an item has only one shape no matter what angle you view it from. It's learned through experience. Brightness constancy, the tendency to perceive an object as being equally bright even when the intensity of light around it changes. This, too, is learned from experience. The brain's use of perceptual constancies can trick the eye with visual illusions. Two visual illusions used by psychologists are the Mueller-Lyer illusion and the Ponzo illusion. So, applying what you've learned, sensory thresholds and perceptual organization, what sensory impressions do you receive and which ones do you filter out? So, in order to do this lab, you'll work with a group to record the sensations you perceive in a normal setting. You'll discuss your experiences with your group members. You'll take part in class discussion in which you compare the results of the lab. Record and illustrate. A sensory recorder will record the sensation he or she feels during the lab. The illustrators will draw pictures that demonstrate some rules about perceptual organization. After completing the lab, discuss your experiences with your group. Share your illustrations. Have your sensory recorder read what he or she recorded. Have the sensory recorder relate what he or she experienced. Have the illustrators relate what they have experienced. As a class, have each group take turns presenting the illustrations and recordings. Have a class discussion about the lab, answering questions in your textbook. So, which rule of perceptual organization do these drawings illustrate? How do you know the people in each drawings are the same height? This concludes our discussion of Chapter 4, Sensation and Perception in Psychology. Thank you for listening. I hope you found this an enjoyable experience.